is for good men to stand by and do nothing. It's exactly why Duan and I in this debate, as OG are going to show you, well, we are the good men that will not stand by and do nothing. Why do we say we're going to do nothing if that's important? So let's first get some context here of what's occurring in the Ukraine, just quickly. What we saw was there was mass uprising from the Ukrainian populace because of the previous Ukrainian president that said that he was more pro-Russia. So we found that there was a populace that was in conflict because they were supposed to be signing a deal, free trade in the European Union, becoming more a part of the more Western civilization, more west side of the European Union. And we found that there were protests and there were great issues with not wanting to join Russia and being under the thumb and under the oppression of the Russian populace and of Putin and his regime and his governments. So we see that there were massive protests here. We see that these protests then escalated to the fact that we allowed the previous president to be kicked out of office. So what then this means that an interim government was installed in that was not pro-Putin and was more pro-them trying to get Ukraine back on track here. Why do I and OG would actively wish to condemn the Russian populace for their actions for invading the Ukraine and Crimea? It's because when you take 15,000 troops and go and invade on the sovereignty of another nation and of its territories, we actively condemn you and we're not for shaming that at all. Right. All of it, why? No thanks. First, how are you going to be condemning them? We believe it's important for active processes to take place, an active condemnation, because we need a strong stance to be taken here today, and why these people and the Russian people need to learn a lesson. Firstly, we're freezing the top assets of the top echelons in Russia and of the Russian businessmen. We feel these are prominent businessmen. We feel businessmen that are not wanting to do damage to their reputation as well as their funding. So they're providing a lot of funding towards the Russian populace or the Russian government in the first place. So we want to freeze those assets and make sure that we curb it in the first place there. So that's why we would actively condemn them for their government acting out upon that, and we would actively make sure that they would put pressure on that government to say, we need to do something about this, we need to get out of the Ukraine because the assets are being affected, no thank you. And second of all, what we do is then, in natural gas, we would not buy any natural gas from Russia. And why do we say this here? Because they will, opening opposition is going to no thanks, is that we're going to be needing this natural gas. Russia also needs to sell this natural gas in the first place. If we hit them hard where it hurts economically, because this accounts for 30% of their GDP, that makes them think twice about why they're in Ukraine in the first place. No thanks. So in terms of that, we would not buy this natural gas. And what also is then happening, the United States allows the slate gas production, which is allowed to ease the nature of the gas dependency that we have here as well. So they could help in the interim in terms of that very much so. And thirdly, the G8 talks. We ensure that Russia would not be a part of those G8 talks in the first place and wanting to have their voice heard. Because in having their voice, they have not earned the right and they infringe upon the sovereignty of another country. It's exactly why we were not allowed to be a G8 and have their opinion to be heard because they do not deserve the right for their opinion to be heard. And maybe it makes them think twice about that. Right. Before I carry on to why this needs to be done and why the international president needs to be set himself.
When Russia is going to bail out Ukraine at $150 billion, how is it that Russia gets to not have an influence on their economy?
That's exactly why we say they're not allowed to have an influence on their economy. Because you know what comes with that $150 million bailout? It comes with conditions. That we run your country, we run your media with our propaganda, and we run your court. It comes with conditions. The Ukraine didn't want that in the first place. That's why Putin is installing these troops in there to promote fear in the interim government, for them to say, you know what, we want you to have a government that's more pro-Russia, so you need to get the hell of Dodge here. So we believe that's important there. The second issue that we have here, why an international president needs to be skipped here, is that when we have another country invading on the sovereignty of another country, we find it's a violation. Why is it a violation? Because the Ukraine should be allowed to be in control of its own destiny and decisions. Why do we say this? Because the influence of Russia in controlling the Ukraine, we see why do they want the Ukraine in the first place? And Johan's going to be speaking more about that. The intentions of Putin himself, of wanting to be continuously a world superpower and wanting to get back on the map because he sees his economy is struggling. We see that it's important we step into national presidents here and condemn active condemnation for Russia that is wrong. Because if we see what happened in Georgia, for example, it's very important. Because what happened in Georgia, and here's it, I find it quite appalling, is because what happened in Georgia is that they are allowed to expand their territories and Russia was allowed to exert their authority upon Georgia and dictate to them what terms could be had. It's It's exactly because we allowed the Georgia conflict to slide that we allowed Crimea to continue further. It's important that if we don't stop this in its tracks, and if we don't allow this active condemnation to take place, I'll take you a second, Michelle, this active condemnation to take place in the first place, we won't want an international thing to occur, such as Georgia and now with Crimea, if it continuously occurs, and we set that precedent that Russia can do what they want and continue to just expand and expand and expand their territory, because they're now going to get away with it. This active condemnation needs to be taking place to deal with that pressure. Go, Michelle.
Do you really think they're expanding their territorial exertion control and the only three allies that Russia has is Syria, Belarus, and Cuba?
But it's exactly that. It's because they have so many more allies. They wanted to expand their power and expand their reach in the first place and take advantage of these countries in the first place. It's exactly what we find that appalling problem. It's because they realize our back's against the walls, guys. We need to get more of these people on our side. We need to have a more strategic advantage. We see that's the problem with in the Black Sea, what happened there, is that they want this naval base. It's why they urged the president before that, allow us to keep our naval base and we'll let you sell gas at cheaper prices for you. It's exactly that because they wanted that strategic position to be that power. So it's important here that we set a strong precedent. We condemn what Russia has done here, because if we allow them to continue what they are doing, to expand their territories, and we do not tell them what you did in Georgia was wrong, what you're doing in Crimea is wrong, we need to take a strong stance. It's important that we take that stance today, because when we take that stance, we allow that active condemnation to take place to tell Russia, enough is enough, stop expanding your territory, stop infringing upon the sovereignty of another country. And this is important to understand. Putin's statement before his ally Yanukovych was thrown out was that we should never interfere on the sovereignty of another country. And he was all for not jumping in at any point. When his ally that was going to put him in power and allow him to have greater influence over the Ukraine, greater increase his hold, was kicked out, he then all of a sudden sent 15,000 troops into Crimea. And this is important, the perception also. He also, the higher parliament and lower parliament, not only said to invade Crimea, but to invade the Ukraine as a whole. It's an international pressure we need to stop in our tracks. For shame as much as we like, so evil cannot reign. And we're the two good men here are saying, let it reign no more.
The road to hell is paved with good intentions. The point Michelle and I are bringing to you today is that the stakes are much higher when we react in this situation than what the stakes would be in not acting at all.
Yeah.
We can prove this under points of saying what reaction will cost and what no action will mean. We're also going to prove this under the headings of, if we look at history, especially what happened in Georgia. Secondly, we're going to look at give the people what the people want. And then thirdly, is going to prove to you how there is no infringement on sovereignty of the Ukraine. Okay? So going to our first point, just in a point of summation, what our team line today is the effects of reacting will mean lots of things. Firstly, the Ukraine at the moment is a pressure cooker. We see that there are lots of high-running tensions, and a war, and especially a world war, can be started with just warning fire being interpreted in any other way. So we wouldn't want the West on their white horses driving and saving us from the evil Putin, because that will prompt even a larger world war, putting in other superpowers and regional powers. Secondly, we think that pushing back Russia will just cause a backlash from Putin if we all take into account the pride of Russia and Putin being an ex-KGB man. You will not let it stay there, especially not losing a base, which is the only warm water base on that side of the earth to exert some sort of control in the Middle East. We also say that it's a necessary check on Western power in the Middle East that we will take away when they don't have that military base and some sort of control in Crimea anymore. We also say that so now the other points of acting is we say that Russia is respecting the people in Crimea's self-determination. They went in with a military presence, they didn't go into military attack, they're waiting for an outcome of the referendum that will be held this Sunday, the 16th of March. We also say that they're gaining a relatively poor area. I mean, this is not some mineral-rich area which will all of a sudden prop up Russia to be a world power again. This is just some region somewhere with not lots of resources, so it won't prop up their power anymore. We also say that Russia has very few allies, and they're steering even more allies away by the day by these actions of themselves. So give them enough rope to hang themselves. Even China is distancing themselves from the actions of Russia. No, thank you. And you also say, like, they only have 5 nations only 5 nations recognize the 2 states in Georgia which Russia invaded in 2008. So it just proves that not acting has fewer states than reacting. Coming to my first independent point is...
What information?
No, thank you. Is to say that if we look at history, if we look at 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia and the 2 provinces, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, we see that 60% of Crimea is native Russian-speaking people. The people in those 2 provinces in Georgia are also Russian-speaking people. The only thing Putin is doing is protecting the interests of native Russian-speaking people in those areas. We say that if we look at those 2 provinces in Georgia at the moment, we see that there's not mass uprisings. People are not totally unhappy being pseudo-independent states falling under Russian control. We see that they are relatively happy. Their economy is growing. We don't see that they are so unhappy that Russia is just being a total dictator and oppressing people in those 2. So we don't see why we must overreact now. The West did nothing then. We see the consequences of that. Why should we overreact now when we don't see these uprisings? Yeah,
so it's exactly the prism that's created. When the people in Georgia, it's our people of Russia. It's the people in Crimea, it's our people of Russia. So we'll step in. It's not a false pretense that they're doing it.
For shame, sir, I'm going to come under the point where why no international law in terms of sovereignty was infringed. Because there are, if you just look at in 1954, Crimea was given to the Ukraine by the USSR to have administrative powers over. So administratively, Crimea belongs to Ukraine, but culturally and ethnically, Crimea belongs to Russia. So the people in Crimea want Russia to exert some sort of power there. They want to belong to Russia. No, thank you. So we've been proving to you that history points that there isn't some mass negative effects. Secondly, we're looking at what the people want. So 4 weeks ago, there was a poll done in Crimea, and 41% of people living in Crimea said they want to fall under Russian control. That was 4 weeks ago. Now, Russia has put their money where their mouth is. They moved in. They showed some support to the ethnic Russians living in Crimea. We argue now that much more than 41% and a much large majority will now, in the referendum on Sunday, say we want to fall under Russian control. We want to be a province of Russia. No, thank you. We also say that the point we made. So Crimea only administratively falls under the Ukraine. The people there ethnically still feel they believe and belong to Russia. Closing.
So do you feel that 67 deaths since the military intervention is cause enough to condemn these actions?
So, I mean, there hasn't been clear, I can also say there's been 100 deaths there, 100 deaths there. There's been no clear reporting on exactly how many people died. What has happened there, and I'm going to tell you now, I'm sort of going to move on to this point, why there was no clear infringement of the international principle of sovereignty. So, Putin moved his forces in at the time when the Ukraine had no legitimate government. Opposition should be listening because this is important. Putin moved in at the time when Ukraine didn't have an elected legitimate government. Viktor Yanukovych was moved out. There was an interim government that wasn't elected, that was skewed representation to anti-Russian, anti-Jew Semitism. We see the deputy prime minister of the new government there. His name is on that page. His name is Oleg Tyanin-Bok, and he is from a group that is very anti-Russian and anti-Jew. And he said that he blames the Ukraine's problems on the Jewish and Russian mafia. So we see strong anti-Russian and Jew sentiment in the new skewed representative government that we see in here. So Putin moved his forces into a time when there was no legitimate government, when he felt that the native Jews of the native Russians in Crimea was under a real threat. And he didn't move in with a military attack, he moved in with a military presence. If there was some casualties along the way, it was Ukrainian forces who resisted this military presence, and not by Putin just killing civilians. So we say for these 3 reasons that history has proven that Russia wants to protect their native citizens, that we see that they're respecting the people's will to self-determination, and thirdly that there was no infringement on the principle of sovereignty because Putin moved into a time when there was no legitimate government in Ukraine. For all those reasons we say, acting will have much worse consequences.
We believe that the occupation of Crimea is illegal under international law.
and it is for Europe and the US to actually start taking a stand, to actually implement sanctions, to send a bigger precedent, to say that Russia, although you might be on the other side of the wall, you simply cannot do what you want to do. You simply cannot undermine another country's sovereignty, and you simply cannot just infiltrate whenever you want to. I'll be proving this by three arguments, but before I get to that, I have a few points of rebuttal. First, I'll deal with Johan's point of we protect the people that's native Russian. We say bullshit to that for two reasons. One, that just because I am native Dutch doesn't mean the Netherlands can just as well come and intervene in another country just to protect me. Why? Because my country has its very own sovereignty. More than that, just because they use the Russian language they fuck to doesn't necessarily mean that I'm native Russian, because that's the claim. Because they speak Russian doesn't mean that they are Russian in the first place. Then you undoors this point of an interim government that hasn't been elected, right? So first of all, we say that it's very convenient for Putin and opposition to make this claim, to say, oh, it's because I have an interim government, a non-elected government, that we all of a sudden can intervene. We say that happens a lot, where there is instability to an extent when interim government has to jump in and actually govern the country. Two, as soon as the interim government was actually reinstated, or instated for that case, the people of Ukraine was happy. This fits with what the population, the larger majority of Ukrainian people want. You can for shame all you want. It's fact of the matter that the protest stopped the moment the interim government was instated. You aren't going to laugh all you want. The reason why there's instability right now is because Russia is coming in with trucks, right? And then he said, and then another reason is that the claim that Putin was afraid of mass genocide. Mr. Speaker, was there mass genocide? No, there wasn't. We would say that if there is any mass genocide in the first place, it's because of what they were doing. Any points of information? Yes.
Wouldn't you say that it's Russia's duty to intervene when there's an illegal government with fascist and Nazi intentions?
So first of all, we can't just assume that they've got Nazi intentions. More than that, even if they did, it corresponds with what the people want. It's what the population of Israel want. They were primarily against what Yanukovych stood for. Because why? It's because they wanted to go into Europe. They wanted to form part of the European Union. As a fact of the matter, it's very convenient for Putin to make this state claim. We would argue that's not actually what he wants. Because what Putin wants is he doesn't want Ukraine to become part of the Western democratic society, which we call the EU and US. We say it's very convenient for them to make that claim. We say there's bigger problems here. That brings me actually very nicely to my first point. What is Putin's actual motive here? So, here's the thing. Not too long ago, Putin once said that the collapse of the Soviet Union is the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. What do we see on the man with this mentality? He wants to fix, not only, he wants to fix this fact, this mistake, this geopolitical catastrophe by using the methods they used previously, like coercion, like blackmail, and quite frankly, wars. You see, this is, he wants to create this customs union that they call it. And they need the Ukraine because of, not only of the Ukraine's influence, but because of their geographical position. We say that, and this is actually where we have to make a real, we have to identify a clash here, because we say that the annexation of Crimea isn't their final goal, because the parliament actually said, when they wanted to pass this intervention, they wanted to intervene in all territories of the Ukraine, not just Crimea. What does that tell us? We say that Putin doesn't necessarily just want to stop there to protect the Russian people. He's got bigger goals here. We say that Putin's, and this is also where I want to actually identify a clash here, also a rebuttal, because Putin's claims of supposed self-determination of people's language and their native culture, whatever, is absurd for two reasons. Because we see that not too long ago, there were wars in the Eastern European countries and in the Czech area. We say that the wars in Chechnya, for instance, suggest that the Kremlin isn't supportive of the idea of protecting people's culture, right? We say that Russia at that time had the mentality of, although these people are different than I am, although they speak a different language, we would still be willing to intervene. That's one point of their mentality. More than that, we say that not too long ago, Russia never signed the European Charter. I'm going on. Listen,
that Russia never signed the European Charter for regional or minority languages, while Ukraine did so not too long ago. That tells us they don't really care about what language you are, what your native culture is. We just want to intervene because we can use this as our reason or as our motive. Yes.
So you're our point that you'll be thwarting the will of the people when they vote in the referendum to be part of Russia and you're denying the people of Crimea that right.
Okay. So here's the thing. We can't, like I already explained, that Russia's not just going to stop at Crimea, right? We say that because we need intentions here. We also can't assume that just because a margin, amount of people who are also of the same culture than Russian means that they actually want to be part of Russia. The thing is what Putin did. He said, I'll give you guys passports. If you guys do feel unsafe, you can come into our country. That doesn't mean we can actually undermine your sovereignty to just intervene. We gave you passports. If you feel unsafe, come to us. That was as easy as it is. Then we also can't go, why is it so wrong that when one big major mass power in the country actually overpowers a country like America? We say, and this is also where we flag them up, because we say they also identify that Ukraine can't really help themselves, that Russia had so many investments in Crimea. One, we say that Ukraine can't really do something about this, right? Although they might want to, they simply can't because they don't have the capacity to do so. We say that because of Russia's financial input and influence, they also can't really express their discontent with what Russia is doing. And we see that there's a mentality of Russia, much like it was in Grenada not too long ago, America intervened there. We say that Russia has a mentality of, I'm a big dog, I have too many influence, and you're a small dog, Ukraine, so we're going to do with you whatever we want to. To that extent, we say it's not justified, and we say that because of this possible genocide, people of Ukraine actually being put in, jeopardizing the people of Ukraine's safety and actually what they want is being jeopardized, and for those reasons we are more than proud to oppose. Thank you.
No one wants to debate on the side of opposition today is because the majority of the media we read happens to be a westernized media. The majority of the media we read happens to be a media that tells us just how bad and wrong and evil Putin is. And maybe what the majority of us as debaters need to do is just as when we have to consider whether maybe we don't want to be hardcore liberals, or maybe when it is that we need to argue that every woman doesn't need to be the top end of the corporate ladder and be a brilliant mother and wife, that in this case, in this debate particularly, what Joanne and I are arguing is that why it is that we don't want to condemn Russia is because what they have decided to do by sending their 15,000 troops to Korea is negligible and insignificant if we don't act. But that the very thing that Putin banks on is that the majority of the world, the majority of Europe, and the majority of America is going to react exactly the way that our government does today. And that means lighting the spark for a powder keg. We have no idea how far it's going to go. So let's quickly, I'm going to quickly just tell you the three things that I'm going to be looking at. Firstly, why it is that Putin will allow the people of Crimea to get what they want. Secondly, I'm going to be dealing with the hypocrisy from the West. And thirdly, how we're going to lead Putin to his own insignificance. Before that, I've got 4 points of rebuttal. So, firstly, we've heard how it's so terrible when Russia gives its bailout to the Ukraine because then they're going to control Ukraine, and that's just absolutely so terrible. So we'd argue that we're choosing the lesser of two evils here. Because on the one hand, the Eurozone goes, we're bailing out the pigs, and we don't have the money, and we really don't care enough about the Ukraine to make them part of a bailout package that we would consider. And so Russia goes, but we, however, are willing to do this. And that just because they're willing to offer you money isn't always the worst thing. Because wait for it. This is not a, I give you money and get to control you. This is the nature of bargaining and of negotiations. On the one hand, it's easy for the West to point fingers at how bad and evil it is if Russia controls the Ukraine, but they're not willing to step in and save the Ukraine from a bailout when they need $150 billion. And Russia is willing to go, wait, we negotiate. You allow us to extend our lease to 2042 with the Black Sea port vessels, and then we're willing to bail you out. So this means they're on an equal footing and platform to be allowed to go, I negotiate with you to get something, and then I get something, whereas the West just goes, I negotiate nothing, but want everything. Second point here, doesn't mean that they are natively Russian, right? Like, it doesn't mean that the people of Russia actually, the people of Crimea actually want this. So, like, did you listen to the bold assertions that Duan makes of how, like, just because you speak Russian doesn't necessarily mean you're Russian? Like, no! On the slide of us, we provide you with superior analysis here to tell you that up until no, guys, I'm not going to take a POI until I get to my positive matter. So, like, 1954 was the first time that Crimea was actually put as a goodwill token into the hands of the Ukraine. That people in Crimea don't just speak Russian, but associate with the way, the lifestyle, the culture, and the system of governance that Russia wants. And our point goes completely unresponded to when Jan tells you that 4 weeks ago, before Russia was willing to put their money where their mouth is, 41% of the population was willing to go, we'd like to consider what Russia has to offer us. We think even more so now when they're able to go, wow, look at the fact that they're willing to preemptively protect us should right-wing factions within an interim government decide to have anti-Russian sentiments. Right, then how the people of the Ukraine are supposedly so happy with what's happening. This is the mischaracterization that they're giving on the side of government. The western part of the Ukraine is all happy with how it works. This is why Crimea can fall under Russia, because there's a vast difference between what the west of the Ukraine wants and what the east of the Ukraine wants. Fourth and final point of rebuttal here, how, but it was terrible because the Parliament of Russia gave permission for them to move into the whole of the Ukraine. Great. Until Russia decides to move through the boundary of Crimea, we are not going to condemn them for something they have not yet done, and currently they have done nothing more than protect the boundaries of Crimea. They have their own naval fleet there, and they have a vested interest in being able to preemptively protect what is currently theirs. If right-wing Western, right-wing anti-Jewish semantics ensures that they lose what they already have, namely their naval base, then we have to sit with the how do we get this back situation. We think it's far better for them to preemptively protect their naval base. I'm going to take close.
So Michelle, do you think there are better ways of protecting interest than by forcing it by military action?
So this is the thing. In this case, we think a military presence is exactly what people in the Ukraine need to realize, that what the people of Crimea want is Russia. And that they are willing to stand by with the biggest force they have, namely a military force. Up until they went, we're taking 15,000 paratroopers and bombing the whole of Crimea. We think that what Russia was doing was making a very moderate choice by simply putting a prisoner there, not putting a bullet into the heads of innocent civilians. So a large amount of my positive matter has been covered within my rebuttal. So these are just independent points here that I'm going to be looking at in order to flesh out our argumentation. So why is it that Putin is going to allow the people to get what it is that they want? We've heard that Putin has been so terribly accused of propaganda and the mass uprising that he's going to ensure occurs. And so the legitimate question needs to be asked whether when the referendum happens on the 16th of March, whether they're going to actually allow free and fair referendum to take place. And we're arguing that the only thing that Putin can stand on right now is in the eyes of the international community. He gives the people of Crimea what it is that they want. We're arguing that he will do nothing to jeopardize the fact that the will of the people needs to be heard in this referendum, and we think this gives him the best likelihood of being able to run a free and fair referendum. But more so, we hear secondly about this hypocrisy from the West. So the US is so quick to talk about how terrible the sovereignty was that they infringed upon. Jan has already told you, this was not a democratically elected government that they infringed upon here, but an interim government, and so we think it's perfectly fine for them to have taken the stand when this government was not legitimately chosen. But why is this so much more of a problem when we see the hypocrisy from the West? So when the USA is allowed to enter into Libya and they break sovereign international law, when they're allowed to enter into Syria and break sovereign law, when they're allowed to enter into Panama, Kosovo, Grenada, then no one says anything is so wrong because America is doing this. We're arguing why it is that we don't give Russia the same benefit of the doubt when they feel that they need to protect their interests. We're arguing that world wars occur lastly when hysteria, rapid nationalism, and private moral
Now, what we see here is we stand against what Russia is imposing, the entire fact of how they are going about their business, not what's taking place. If the people want it, that's cool. There are many democratic ways in which they could create policies, but what we're against is is the way Russia is acting. Now, before I get to my points, I'd like to do some rebuttal. Now, firstly, Crimea was given as a present to the Ukraine. Now, we see that the mentality of Russia here is wrong. You cannot trade in individuals and nations as it is a commodity. Individuals should not be given and taken. That's not the way the world works. It's against the principle of it. It's against the principle. Now, the principle that countries and lives can just be taken. We cannot stand for this. This is absolutely completely wrong. Now, secondly, media has been westernized. Yes, media is westernized, but if there are 67 confirmed deaths already, confirmed as in they've seen the bodies,
What information?
yes, I said.
As opposed to the World War, your line of actions will impose. I mean, forcing Russia out, prompting other world powers to get involved, and losing more lives than was already lost in Crimea.
That's not what we're saying. We're not instigating a world war. What we stand for here is for the rest of the world to go and to make a hard stance to say what Russia is doing is wrong. Now, going on. The bailout that was given by Russia, that was unconditional. There were no strings attached. It was not I give you money and you give me your country. It's not about what the people want. It's about for shame, sir. What we see is Russia is imposing its power on the people. Military action has forced the people to side with Russia. The fact that they went and they put 15,000 people in the spot shows you clear and definitely that if you do not side with Russia, there's 15,000 people that will stand against you. Moving on. We also condemn with what the US has stated. We do not think that what they did in many of the countries that they went against law was right. But the whole fact of the matter is we do not want war. Dot.
Yes.
We do not want war. Now, moving on to my first argument. The sovereignty of a country. Now, within a country, we have different kinds of people. We have different views and we have different cultures. And that's why democracy stands. Because you have the majority and the minority that have, to an effect, a vote, saying what's happening in the country. Now, what's happening here in Russia is they're imposing their own ideology at the expense of others. They are furthering their own agendas. They are going and they are creating, to their extent, they are creating their own little country within another country. This is not democracy. We are taking away countries' rights to develop in the way that they choose to and the way that they want. This is not democracy. Democracy stands for the majority and the minority. And not only the 60% of Russians that are currently in Ukraine. Now, Georgia, if you look at Georgia,
What is the question, sir?
nothing. If you look at what happened in Georgia, 608 citizens lost their lives because Russia was allowed to go in, sweep in there, kill a shitload of people, and in all truth, 5 days later, just by international policy, they were forced out. Now, we want to stop that. Human lives are of utmost importance in this case. And we don't want these unnecessary lives to be lost, because ultimately, what this goes about is about human life.
But on that point, sir,
Yes, I accept.
don't you think we can leave Putin to his insignificance, irrelevance, alienating his allies, and not respond to the war he wants to create by condemning his actions?
Don't you believe that if we do not condemn his actions, he will, to an extent, he will grow and he will rise, he will create more individuals, and to this, and we'll lay this with such a larger power that it will be impossible to. Now, there are more democratic ways to change a policy, not by civil uprising, not by sending up 15,000 troops, but by going and debating and creating a policy for these individuals. No, thank you. As we see here, is that true democracy is being undermined. If the people want action, they can do so democratically, not by dropping 15,000 troops. What we also see here is that Russia is to an extent going and creating an untouchable country. We see that it's trying to annex countries that are close to it and trying to reform the previous USSR, as we see with Georgia, the failed attempt of Georgia. And the problem with this untouchable continent is firstly the fact that we have no accountability. If Russia was to go and annex the Ukraine, they will, to a large extent, they'll be able to expand their territory even more, since they will have more military power. They will be able to do, to a large extent, exactly what they want, because international interests and international powers will not be able to stop them. But if big enough a country, they'll be big enough a country to act the way they want, since no one could act against their power. Nothing. Now we see that it's already difficult to act against Russia the way that it is currently. Imagine the way it would be if Russia was the USSR back again, and we had a shitload more economic power in that country. Now, Russia wants to take over other territories, and this is the underlying problem that we want to handle. Now, the individual's freedom is currently being undermined. Freedom of individuals are being brought down. Russia is going and taking away choice. What we see here is the extent of dictatorship. They are imposing whatever they want upon the people. The people have no say in what's happening, because military force backing Russia allows Russia to do exactly what they want within this country, because it does not have the economic, it does not have an army to back itself like Russia does. And sorry. We see that Russia only cares about its own interests, and this is what's wrong. What we see here is a Russia that's trying to go and undermine other individuals, undermine other countries, undermine the way that other individuals think, and create its own mega power. This is wrong, and this is why so thankfully we want to stand against it. Thank you. Oh, stand for this project.
Putin is this horrible bad guy with worst intentions, is trying to expand Russia without any valid analysis on why there is a bad thing if Russia is expanded. But what we would argue, right, as me and Zella would argue, the fact that when Putin intervenes because he has the best interests of Crimea, Russia, and, well, frankly, world peace at heart, and he is justified to intervene. So, what are the extensions that we as a closing opposition can bring to you? We're going to talk about the rising tension between the West and Russia, how this would benefit Crimea more, and then the intention of Putin in this. So, but before this, just a few independent points of rebuttal. So first I'm going to look at this idea which I think is relevant to address. This idea of how they want to intervene and how they as a government chooses to place a sanction upon Russia, and why we see this is impractical. So we feel that when Germany buys 40% of gas from Russia, and they are the strongest in the EU due to their efficiency, they wouldn't want to place any sanctions that would affect their efficiency. Furthermore, we see that Britain is also so much independent from energy that they get from Russia that they wouldn't veto any G8 leak out of Russia. But more importantly, we would argue that the G8 keeps Russia in check. At the moment when you remove Russia from the G8, nothing would stop them from launching a full-on attack on Ukraine. So let's move on to my next point of rebuttal. This is the intentions of Russia intervening. So what Zilla and I will bring you is to say that, well, we feel that the EU and NATO has more of an intention to intervene, or more of an intention to gain border access to Russia, and that is a bigger problem. I'm going to argue that in my first argument. Furthermore, we heard that, well, this point of Russia giving Crimea to Ukraine, and why? So we're going to look at the best interest of Ukraine. So the reason why Russia gave Crimea to Ukraine is for the plain and simple reason that, well, it's just more practical for Crimea to get water and electricity from Ukraine than it is for Russia for the pure simple reason that Crimea isn't connected geographically to Russia, right? So this is the best interest of Crimea. So we see it's justified at the moment when the best interest of Crimea isn't anywhere out there for Russia to intervene. And then my last point of rebuttal is that we heard pretty much from closing government that there would be more democratic ways, and we would argue that it's possible for more democratic ways with illegal governments and that has no incentive for political debate. Yes, John?
Don't you think it's indicative, and this is also the opening opposition, that if Putin believes that no one will do anything about it, it's exactly what he wants, and he will continue to do as he pleases.
So, exactly, that's a wonderful point, the intention of Putin. Putin Putin's intention is not so bad. And that is obvious when Putin realizes, well, that my wealth dropped with 20% because I intervened in Russia, in Ukraine. We realize that the intention is not for any economical benefit, but that it's actually a good and pure intention. But my first argument is about the rising tension between West and Russia. And so what we heard, well, we know that there's a rising hate between the West and Russia, pretty much. We see this with we see this with Syria and America, what's in Syria with America and Russia, but Russia funding Syria. We see this with all-out nuclear threat, tension between the EU and NATO and Russia, and Ukraine, the fact that Ukraine wants to sign the EU. So we have a problem with this? No. We have a problem with this the moment that the EU sides with Ukraine, right? So we feel that the moment that the EU sides with Ukraine, there's a gap for NATO to have nuclear weapons and missiles on the border of Russia. So why is this such a bad thing? And Russia and Putin obviously realize this, right? This is a problem that is just not only the problem that we have a fascist government there, but pretty much the problem exists. That the moment you allow NATO and EU to gain access to the border of Russia, you're exposing them to the rising tensions between the West and the East. And we see that's already a problem. A third world war is more likely to occur when the EU gains power in Ukraine and tension rises in Ukraine. In fact, there is more border access to Ukraine, more border access to Russia for Western countries, yes.
Don't you believe that this tension wouldn't be there if Russia didn't invade in the first place?
So we feel the tension would be there for the fact that the illegal government of Ukraine made it clear that they want the EU to be part of Ukraine. We see this as a problem. We don't want that. Russia doesn't want that because they realize the rising tension, the moment when we have NATO standing on the border of Russia, threatening them. We see this as a problem. We don't want that because that's more likely to create a third world war than it is. No, thank you. My second argument is, why would Crimea benefit more from Russia than from any EU country, right? So, we argued, well, it came to light, it came to light that, well, Ukraine owes more than, billions of amounts of money in debt to Russia, right? We see an economic downfall within Ukraine. We could argue that the EU would help, but with my previous argument, it's obviously why we could not let the EU help at the cost of rising tension between West and North, and why it would so much better for Crimea to be part of Russia, right? So, Crimea was already bought into Russia. No. Due to the fact that we can see, pre-1954 we had Crimea as a Russian state, and we see that the fact that most people, the majority in Russia are Russian-speaking citizens, right? So yes, we heard that, well, the fact that the sovereignty of being, the fact that, this idea of sovereignty, but the moment the moment when Russians go, well, the moment when the best interest of the Crimeans, of the Russians in Crimea is not at the heart of the Ukrainian people, and the moment when we have illegal, non-democratic government within Ukraine, we see that while the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 is invalid, and the fact is they can intervene in Crimea without any problem there, right? Without having to condemn it, right? Because Russia's interest is in the benefit for a struggling Crimea. They don't really care what happens to the rest of the freaking Ukraine. They want Crimea for the benefit of the intention of what the intention of interest for the Russians in Crimea. So my third argument, and this is important, the real intentions of Putin. And why it's not, this clashes specifically with OG, and why they say we have a selfish benefit, right? So the moment when they intervene in Ukraine, we see a 20% wealth drop for Russia, right? So, for the fact that this was for selfish reasons, we would see that they would just pretty much leave Crimea because Crimea offers no specific benefit to Russia, right? Yeah. So Russia is more focused on their economy that they would not care about a 20% wealth drop or an 11% drop in the stock market, right? So we would say that this is clearly indicative of pure intention from Putin's side, right? So if I have 20% of my wealth being lost, I would the moment I realize that, take my out of Ukraine. So we see for all of these reasons, the fact that Putin is doing this for the Russian people and for world peace, the fact that we don't want rising tensions between the West and the East, we are so proud to vote.
Our opposition thinking like they have this idea that it's okay what's happening in Ukraine because you know what, Ukraine first belonged to Russia and then we gave it to or Crimea first belonged to Russia and then we just gave it to Ukraine. Okay? So we think they're stuck in this 18th century mentality where you can storm a capital, hoist the flag and claim a nation, okay? And that's what we're trying to say, that in a world where we want to promote things like peace and democracy and values that include sovereignty, okay, things we try to think important to countries, okay? That shouldn't be the world where we're willing to kill 67 people because we wanted military intervention, okay? Not because there was a threat to our people, not because there was any direct threat to our people, except from something as vague as maybe their culture being imposed on, but because of economic and militant reasons. And we think that is wrong at principle level. And that's why we're not arguing policy. Thank you for the government team that brought us this policy. But we're not arguing policy. We're arguing that on a principled level, what Russia has done is wrong, and that is why we condemn it. Okay. One point of rebuttal I'd like to give before I move to my speech, my constructive arguments. Okay. So they try to give us this idea that the reason that there are increasing tensions in the world is because at the end of the day, that the tensions will increase if we do act and we don't give Russia what they want. Okay. I'm telling you, if Russia didn't go into the Ukraine in the first place, that tension wouldn't have been there.
Well,
but then they tell us that the tension would still be there because at the end of the day, the Ukraine is having tendencies to go to the EU. And I'm saying that yes, there may be tensions between Russia and between the Ukraine because of this fact. But I don't think we should be telling Russia that this is okay. You can basically do what you want with other countries, and you can impose your own ideologies of these countries, and we'll just sit back and do nothing because we're scared about it. That's the problem if we have your policy. If the Russians didn't act in the manner which they did, there wouldn't be tension, okay? And they shouldn't be allowed to do what they want in countries like the Ukraine. All right. The rest of the world shouldn't sit back and be scared of Russia. Okay.
So we wish that Russia hadn't done this, but now that they have, why is it that we actively condemn them by taking action and not rather just leave Putin to his own insignificance with his 3 little allies?
Okay, I'll get to this later, okay? But I'm going to address this quickly in this manner. If we let Putin, alright, carry on with this, and we tell him it's alright, you went into the Ukraine and had military action there, and that's fine, we're not going to do anything, we're going to sit back and do nothing, okay? What's going to happen next? He's going to go into countries like Belarus and Poland, who will be the next countries to be slippery slope, okay? No, it's not a slippery slope, okay? Because he tried it in Georgia and it failed. He tried it in the Ukraine, okay, and it failed. If it fails or even doesn't fail, we're not sure if it's going to fail or not, okay? But we know that that Russia wants to impose this USSR continent, and that's why it's going to happen, okay? First one I'd like to do, this whole idea of actions and reaction and why no action at all is better, okay? And they're trying to sketch this picture that at the end of the day, Putin is not that bad. He's only to protect Russians, and he's trying to protect Russian interests, okay? And Johan told us, like, the 67 deaths are speculation. I don't think it's speculation. You know what I think is speculation? To tell me that Putin tried to act in the interests of that's what I believe is speculation, okay? Because what I want to say is that he was rather trying to protect his military interests in the Crimea, okay? In the Black Sea. Because he knows if he has the Black Sea, he has a military strong point, and that other military action won't be able to get it through the strong point, okay? So they have to sail around a whole continent where they can bomb the shit out of you before you actually get to Russia, okay? That's why he wants Crimea, and that's why he wants the Black Sea, and that's why he wants his navy there, okay? And then he wants to create this untouchable continent, and that's why Sean, if we let Russia do what they want, okay? Because at this stage in time, they're vetoing the shit out of anything that the US imposes, okay? And they can basically do what they want in the countries. That's the standard that we'll be setting. We'll be telling Russia, it's okay to do that, you can veto, you can do exactly what you want. You know what? If you want to infringe on people's rights in the country, it's fine. Because if you have the Black Sea, you have that military stronghold, okay? You'll be able to do what you want because the rest of the world won't be able to touch you. Okay. I think what they're rather trying to do is to force this USSR-like alliance, and that's the point that I'm trying to get to, Michelle. This whole idea that if we leave them to do what they want to do in the Ukraine, we're setting a standard. They're going to invade Belarus and Poland next, okay? Because this is what's going to happen. If you're going to try and argue international stability, you need to realize that Belarus and Poland are signed into the NATO Act, okay? And then you're going to force America to act if Russia intervenes there because they signed into the NATO Act. And I think there are a hell lot of countries, like North Korea, who would like to wait. They would so like to want America to see if NATO is going to act on this, okay? Because they want to see whether NATO will actually come upon what the policies are, okay? So if you're arguing that this will, not acting is going to ensure international stability and peace, okay? I think the fact that we'll be forcing NATO to act if they intervene further, okay? That will at all, that will not cause international stability.
At some point you need to tell us why, for the past 35 years, they've had the Black Sea naval fleet and Russia hasn't actively done something military-based. All of a sudden, now that they may lose it, they're going to start a naval war.
So I don't think that Russia wants to bomb the whole world. But the fact that they have the Crimean Peninsula and why they acted in the way where they were scared that they're going to lose is because they know that they're safe. They know if they have this peninsula, they know if they have the Black Sea and they have their naval base there, then they're not any threat because you can't enter Russia from the bottom anymore. They know that you have to sail around the whole country and they can bomb shit if you sail around the whole country. So that's what I'm telling you. This is why they haven't acted militarily, okay? Because they know they can do in the country what they want because it's not easy to get in there. And when you take away criminal, that's the way they acted like they did, okay? Because they're running scared. They know that this can maybe weaken the whole stronghold that they have on their country, and they won't necessarily be able to do what they want because you have a way to enter Russia from the bottom. And that's the way they acted like they want, okay? The way they did, sorry. Second point I want to touch on is this whole idea of sovereignty, okay, and why it's rather important in our sovereignty, okay. So the idea of sovereignty is to protect other countries from the interests of bigger countries and their influence, okay, to protect majority and minority groups. And it's fair to argue there are 60% Russians, but what you're not taking into account is the fact that there are 40% other nationalities in that country, and that you can't impose Russian ideas on those nationalities. And we think there are better ways, by means of democracy and those sort of things, to get the idea that they're not happy with the people. Have democratic means of getting those people out of power. Okay. Third point I'd like to touch on is this whole idea of the standard that we're setting. Okay. We're setting a standard, we believe this week, that you can take a country if you want it, and you can force your ideologies of democracy, militancy on that country if you want to do that, then it's fine. Okay. If you're unhappy with the government, you can carry on, you can have civil uproar because someone will have to intervene militarily. That's the standard what we're setting. And I'm telling you that if you want to get somewhere in this 21st century in the world that we're living in, if you want to have world peace and further democracy and all those core values that we think are so important to us, then we can't let Russia do this. We need to condemn this. We need to set a standard where we say, it's not possible to do exactly what you want. You need to take into consideration the views of other people. And that is why we stand so strong on the side of government.
Although we as opposition do not think what Russia did was good, we do not condemn it, because now that it's done it was a good choice. It was the best for Crimea. Okay, we put three arguments today to oppose government. We said that the tension between the Western countries and Russia will just grow, and we told you that it was to the benefit of Crimea, and we talked about the intentions of Russia. But first I will just rebut. Okay, the opening government brought us that Russia needs to learn a lesson. And we told you that Russia... You must. Okay, Russia will not be... We as a world cannot teach Russia a lesson. As closing brought us, Russia cannot be held accountable. Currently, nobody in this world is able to hold Russia accountable for what they are doing. They have the... playing cards in their hands. They have the resources that we as the rest of the world want. And therefore, the rest of the world will not be able to teach Russia a lesson. Further, you brought us that we are creating an international precedent that say we can infringe on the sovereignty of other countries. We do not say this. Russia did have the right to do this because Ukraine has got a fascistic and Nazi-like government. And nobody wants to be oppressed. Therefore, Russia had the right to stand up and fight for these people. Okay, then closing brought us that Ukraine cannot do anything against Russia because they do not have the resources. Why should they use the little resources they have to fight Russia? Why can they not give Crimea to Russia, especially when Crimea does not have any economical they will not take interest in the problems in Crimea because they do not gain anything from Crimea. Whereas Russia will actually have the people in Crimea who stands for Russia, and therefore they are more likely to fight for the rights in Crimea. Further, you told us that we cannot take or give the countries away as commodities. We say that you can do that, especially when the current government is a new, unstable government with an unsure future and drastic ideologies. Russia can provide a sure future, pride, success, and hundreds worth of years of growth and prosperous life.
It's exactly that mentality of the world cannot hold me accountable, that Putin thinks that he can do whatever he wants to. He wants to condemn that, to stop that ultimately.
We do not think Putin is a good person, but this is not the way to hold him accountable, because the world will not buy into this. The world needs the natural resources. They will not stop buying it. No. Okay. And we said Putin doesn't only takes lives and you care all about the lives. We say the unrest caused by Ukraine is what took lives. Putin and Russia did not take lives. Furthermore, you brought to us that the Black Sea and the natural base is a military strongpoint, and we agree. And that is why Russia would want this. Russia knows that if anybody else has this, we will have to take even more drastic measures to get this. Therefore, we feel, give it to them now, so that they will create even more violence and even more drastic upset to get it. They know that if NATO will have access to the border, we know that if NATO will have access to their border, they will take even more drastic and violent measures to get this back. And therefore we say, give it to them now while they want it peacefully. Okay, no thank you. Okay, now back to our own points that me and Sean brought you. Okay, the tension between the Western countries and Russia is growing, and this will only make it worse. Okay, if the EU sides or Ukraine sides with the EU, this will create a gap for NATO to have nuclear power on the border of Russia. And this is what I told you now. Russia will take even more drastic steps to protect themselves. And therefore we feel the tension will only grow. We feel give Crimea to Russia now, because then we can keep them quiet, we can keep them at bay, and they will not go to even more drastic measures to get this piece of
please.
Okay, no thank you. Further, Crimea will benefit from Russia. Okay, the thing is, we can argue that everybody in Crimea is Russian and they want the Russian government, blah blah blah. But the fact of the matter is, Ukraine don't care about Crimea because they do not have any economical gain, they don't have political support from the people in Crimea, and they do not care for this people or this piece of land, and they will not go through a lot of trouble to protect this. Whereas Russia, on the other side, know that with these people backing them, and with this border in their beset, they have a lot to gain, and therefore they will care for these people, they will care for this land, and they are willing to fight for it. Whereas Ukraine is not willing to do this, and therefore Russia is a better option for Crimea than Ukraine. Okay. And then the last thing we brought to you is.
Okay, so now let me understand. You'd like us to make Russia unreachable so that no one can hold them accountable for their actions. But let's do it now before they hurt someone.
No, we feel that if we give Russia what they want now, we can prevent a third world war. Because they will not try, even in a more drastic matter, to get this piece of sea. They will just be peaceful. Okay. Then the last thing we brought you is the intentions of Russia. Okay, we know that Russia gave up 20% of their wealth to get Crimea, and they didn't even get Crimea yet. They're willing to give even more. This shows how important this is to Russia. They do not have intentions to blow up Ukrainians and to kill civilians and all that. They want this land. And the protest from the Ukrainians themselves is what kills people. It's not Russia that kills people. Okay, and we feel if Russia withdraws now, there will be continued upset. Even if Russia never gets Crimea, this fighting will continue for years and years and years, because there will always be this need for Russia to have Crimea, and therefore they will never stop. Therefore we feel, stop this loss of wealth, stop this loss of resources right now by giving Russia this piece of land, and they protect peace all over the world.